members of the Global 100% Renewable Energy Platform, some other NGOs, some other organizations as well. Now, today, we want to share you our views on the situation, the global situation, if you want. The topic of today is what can renewable energy provide to solve two big global crises that we face globally today. One is, of course, the climate crisis. That's why delegates are meeting here in Bonn, and they will meet again later this year, of course, in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And the other big crisis is, of course, now, it's obvious because of the war that is ongoing in Ukraine, is related to energy security, security of supply. And we want to show you today how renewable energy, we believe that firmly, are the answers to answer both crises. On the one hand, of course, climate change can only be mitigated when we switch completely, entirely to renewable energy, to emission-free renewable energy. On the other hand, renewable energy are domestic, are locally sourced energy sources usually, and they are available practically everywhere. So that is, of course, now starting with this kind of already indicating the answer. But we want to look a bit more into detail, and it's my pleasure that we have today, next to both of us here, two also speakers which join us from other parts of the planet. One will be Bharadwaj Kumamuru from the World Bioenergy Association. He will join us from Stockholm in Sweden. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Dave Rennie, who is representing the International Solar Energy Society here, and he will speak about solar power for energy security and climate protection. Dave, a very good morning first to US. It's early morning on your side. We're very pleased to have you with us. And can you hear us?
I can hear you fine, Stefan. Thank you for the introduction. I do get an echo when I talk. So maybe when I'm giving my talk, you might want to mute your side of the microphone. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So are you able to see my slides?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. If you could mute your microphone, please. Great, thank you. Okay, yes, as Stefan said in his opening comments, our theme today is going to be energy security as well as climate protection. My comments will focus primarily on the status of solar PV around the world and how that is contributing both to achieving energy security as well as climate protection and its prospects for doing so even more in the future. So if you could go to the next slide, please. This is from last year's global solar power. Sorry. Okay, this is from last year's REN 21 Global Status Report. I should point out that some of my slides are going to be using information from that report, but that in just 1 week, the REN 21 will be issuing its update, the Global Status Report 2022. So for sure, these numbers will be changing, and I can try to estimate to some extent how much they'll be changing, but as we go through this. But certainly in 2020, there were significant additions to renewable energy power, as there has been over the past decade or so. And in 2021, I don't have the exact numbers here, but if you could go to the next slide, please, Stefan. This is a more recent figure from the Solar Power Europe's Global Market Outlook about the domination of new installations that are taking place by solar PV. It is by far the single largest new energy source, new power source around the world. The estimate is that 302 gigawatts of power, of renewable power, were added in 2021. This is quite substantially higher than the 256 that was reported for 2020. So if you can go to the next slide. you'll see here, this is again from the Global Market Outlook, which was released a couple of months ago by Solar Power Europe. We have likely passed 1 terawatt of installed solar capacity globally. And much of this is due to significant markets in China, some regions of the Asia Pacific, and the US, and of course, Europe. The annual capacity growth rate is still somewhere in around 39%, which is very substantial. And the annual market growth rate, in other words, how much the annual installations increase on a year-by-year basis, is around 30%. So even with the COVID restrictions and the supply disruptions and labor disruptions that occurred during the worst of the pandemic, we still see substantial growth, and we also know that there are substantial new projects in the pipeline as we go forward. However, let me show you just the next slide. This again is from last year's global status report. The total final energy consumption that's met by renewable energy still remains at around 20% of the total final energy consumption. Now, there has been a small amount of growth over the past decade, but it's still remaining rather stubbornly at about 20%. The main growth is in the power sector, and of course, there's been some growth in the transport sector, but the heating and cooling sector is still very much dominated by traditional fossil fuel sources. This is for industrial applications as well as home heating, water and household heating, cooking. All of these sectors are still dominated by traditional fossil fuel sources and traditional biomass sources as well, not renewable biomass. If we can go to the next slide. Again, I'm going back to the Solar Power Europe Global Market Outlook that shows their best estimate of projections of growth in solar power over the next 5 years. And you can see two scenarios here. One is they call the low scenario, which is kind of a business as usual without new incentives or without aggressive action toward addressing climate change. And then they have a high scenario, which would be a very active program that would get us to 100% renewables or net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And their medium scenario is that red line. And you can see that there's still significant growth, not as much as we have had in the past, but there's still 10 to 12% growth, annual growth in the markets per year, even at their medium scenario estimate. And so we should be installing at their estimate roughly 300 or so gigawatts per year of solar PV by the year 2025. And if you look at the global investments, which is in the next slide, this is information coming from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. We can see that historically the investment in renewable energy is by far the strongest investment in new energy sources worldwide, although it has leveled out somewhat in the past few years. But again, with the policy environment shifting to more and more protection against global climate change, we anticipate that these renewable energy investment numbers will continue to go up. So what this all means for solar, if you can go to the next slide, is that utility scale solar is now becoming the lowest cost option for new power additions around the world. You can see that residential PV, which is rooftop solar, primarily distributed solar, behind the meter solar applications, still remain quite a bit higher than utility scale PV. And the utility scale PV is certainly growing relative to the distributed solar in terms of installations around the world. And utility scale PV is, based on the information coming from Solar Power Europe, is by far, or I shouldn't say by far, but it's definitely the lowest cost followed by combined gas turbine technologies. There's, of course, a wide range in some of these technologies, but you can see even with commercial and industrial PV, which is the orange line to the left, the costs continue to drop and are becoming more and more competitive with all of the other traditional technologies. And if you can go to the next slide, please. We despite these successes in the photovoltaic area, and I'm sure the other renewable technologies are facing the same situation, there's still room for much solar, much R&D, and in the solar area especially, to continue to further reduce costs, and especially the life cycle cost of energy for these technologies. This means improving manufacturing margins and identifying better access to manufacturing, modern day manufacturing technologies, ensuring access to critical materials. This is going to be an important point where if we are going to fully decarbonize our energy system, we really need to have access to certain critical materials that are required in the technologies to achieve that decarbonization. And this has implications for global supply chain and geopolitics. We want to expand marketable applications of photovoltaics. We're looking at technologies such as floating photovoltaics and agri-photovoltaics as two emerging applications where we can combine the use of PV along with other land use practices without disrupting those land use practices. And of course, recycling and reuse standards and protocols really need to be established for PVs, I'm sure with other technologies as well. As the markets expand, older PV systems are eventually going to have to be recycled or disposed of or resold in other formats. So this is going to be very important as we go forward. So my next slide is sort of one that sort of highlights the issue that we're all talking about at SB 56 and certainly in the COPs past and future. And this is related to what is known as the ambition gap. This is, as you can see from this diagram here, which is an excellent visual that was produced by Climate Action Tracker shortly after COP26. You can see on the curve on the left where historical greenhouse gas emissions have already, what levels have already taken place. And you can see that despite actions for climate control and the growth of the renewable energy, our carbon emissions globally continue to increase in the atmosphere. And this is a situation that has to be reversed quickly. And in fact, much more ambition is required by governments around the world and also by local and regional regulatory authorities to rapidly reduce the greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. As you can see, if we want to achieve a 1.5 degrees centigrade cap or target by the year 2100, we need to follow the lowest green curve. And in order to get to that point, we need to close somewhere between 19 to 23 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year emissions level by the year 2030. In other words, we need to cut in half our carbon emissions by 2030. And of course, they need to be zero or even net zero by 2050 in order for us to prevent global warming to exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. So this is a very clear message as to the challenges that we're facing. Of course, the challenges are complicated even further by have been complicated by the COVID pandemic and the supply chain and labor shortage issues that has created, although the renewable energy programs have still remained remarkably on track so far, but we are not beyond that supply chain issue yet. And now the war in Ukraine is further exacerbating the situation. So clearly, the geopolitical situation that we're facing right now is perhaps the strongest hindrance we have toward achieving our climate goals as well as our energy security goals. So if you can go to the next slide, I have been looking at some pathway studies, 100% renewable pathway studies that have been published in the past few years by the IEA and by IRENA and by some private companies. And in order to, how do we achieve a net zero energy or even 100% renewable energy by 2050? And they all have some common features to them. For example, we must rapidly electrify our end-use energy needs. Right now, the electrification sector is roughly 17% of total final energy consumption. We need to get that up to about 50% of total final energy consumption, which means addressing the transport sector, such as EVs, railways, and shipping, and the building sectors. In other words, finding the zero carbon ways of achieving heating and cooling, cooking, and industrial process heating. Electricity will have to be driven primarily from renewables, and this is going to be because of cost. Renewable energy costs are going to be lower than other technology costs. And wind and solar will most likely be the primary supply for this, especially on the power sector. Not necessarily the case in some of the other sectors. The power sector will have to see major grid upgrades to improve flexibility and manage the variable renewable energy. And our total final energy consumption overall, especially per capita consumption, will have to decrease. This will be somewhat of a natural process since there are certain energy efficiencies gained by using renewable energy technologies and shifting over to technologies such as heat pumps and maybe introducing green hydrogen in the economy, in the energy economy. And finally, and as I just said, major growth in the use of green hydrogen will become a significant component of our future energy supply following these paths. So if you can go to the next slide. Just as a quick example here, I looked at the most recent IRENA 1.5 degree centigrade scenario and the IEA's net zero energy by 2050 report, which came out last year. Bloomberg New Energy Finance has a new energy outlook report that's somewhat similar in terms of addressing how do we get to net zero by 2050. And then also the University of Technology Sydney and the Energy Watch Group have published very good comprehensive reports on pathways to get to 100% renewables. And you can see just in terms of how this affects the electricity sector, you can see that all of these scenarios and show that we have to be 50% or higher in terms of our total of electricity use and total final energy consumption. The Energy Watch Group report has a far more aggressive electrification scenario, and that in the next column over, you can also see that electricity supplied by PV will also have to be a substantial contribution. And again, that's going to be driven by costs. And so in the final column, this gives you a sense of the amount of solar PV capacity that will have to result from achieving these scenarios. And as I said, we're currently at right around 1 terawatt. And you can see from the right-hand column that anywhere from 13 to 14, or even as high as 57 terawatts of our electricity supply will be met by solar PV. So the market opportunities for PV are substantial. So my next slide is my summary of key challenges and takeaways. Obviously, we currently still have major investments in carbon emitting technologies, which is going against the curves that I showed you earlier from the climate action tracker. We have to really take ambitious action to hold back and stop our investments in new carbon emitting technologies. Because once, for example, once you buy a new car that uses gasoline as a fuel, that's an investment that will require gasoline for at least the next 20 years and encourage gasoline petroleum companies to continue producing that product. So investments in carbon emitting technologies need to stop quickly. The global negotiations that we see in the COPs still lack sufficient ambition, and that's being further disrupted now by the supply chains associated with COVID and now with the war in Ukraine and other geopolitical barriers and events such as tariff actions and protection of industry within countries, which is not only driving up costs, but is impacting the supply chains. So we need to have a much improved enabling environment with more aggressive policies to make sure that this clean energy transformation does occur, and that where renewable energy technologies are the technologies applied to all end use, and that they're applied to all end use sectors and not just the power sector. And it's clear that energy security is enhanced through widespread application of renewable energy technologies because it reduces the dependency on imported energy supplies. So those are my comments, and thank you for your attention. Here's my last slide. Feel free to contact me if you'd like to discuss my points further, and I will turn the floor back over to Stefan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dave. That was an excellent presentation. On the one hand, presenting the status of, in particular, solar PV and the great prospects that solar PV has, including the barriers, but also giving us a general idea of where renewable energy stands and what renewables can contribute. Dave, I know that you have to leave, although it's earlier morning, so I would like to now ask the audience right away whether there are any questions for you. Do we have any questions or comments?
Yes, maybe I have a couple of questions.
Just introduce yourself.
I
know you, but others.
Yeah, I'm Gunnar Olesen, International Network for Sustainable Energy is a network of non-governmental organizations. And my first question is that we are here at the climate negotiations and looking at, among others, at the national climate plans, the NDCs. And have you been looking at how much they're actually capturing solar and how much of these great scenarios that you showed are actually captured by the NDCs, or are we lacking something there? The other thing is that you mentioned a lot about the potential and the low cost of solar. In the recent IPCC report, they said that up to a certain fraction of the power, solar is very good, but it's difficult to get a very high fraction of the power covered by solar. Do you have a comment to that report?
Yes, thank you for your questions. And regarding the first comment about the NDCs, oh, sorry. Can you hear me? I'm not muted, am I? Okay. Yeah. Regarding your first comment about the NDC, that's a very good comment. And I don't know if that carbon tracker chart shows this. I'll pull it up on my screen just to see. But the NDCs are nowhere near sufficient at this point in time to get us to the 1.5 degree scenario. In fact, I think if this may have changed a little bit after the Glasgow meeting, but certainly after the Paris meeting, there are still concerns that the global warming could go up as much as 3.6 degrees centigrade if we only followed the NDCs and didn't take even further action. And so the NDCs are making a contribution, but we still have what we call this ambition gap that will get us from where the NDCs have us down to the 1.5 degree target. Regarding the materials, or regarding the amount of solar that could be installed, again, you've raised a very good point. As I mentioned briefly in my comments, there are clearly materials issues that have to be addressed, perhaps for all renewables, but certainly on the solar side. If we're going to have, for example, solar PV with batteries as a major power strategy, grid strategy, we're going to need access to the lithium resources, and we're going to need access to copper and good silicon resources for the solar systems. And I know this is a whole separate topic to get into, and I have only been looking at it briefly, but I know there's a lot of studies that are currently being taken to address the material supplies issues in the future. And it is possible that we could start running into some serious limits as we get near some of these levels that I have shown in that chart in terms of future markets, or in terms of future PV markets. So that's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the kind of short answer is clear. No, the NDCs are not sufficient. There must be done much, much more. We hope we see now more momentum in the next weeks, months, and years. That's almost too late. We have other questions, comments? I'm just trying to find, yes, please, first, and then second. We can take, please, together. Sandra, and then first in the front, and if you then hand over the lady behind you.
Yeah, hi. My name is Sandra Prüfer, based here in Bonn, and also engaged with Parents for Future, and currently representing Parents for Future at the German Roundtable for Renewable Energies. And we are talking a lot about decentralized energy transition and to accelerate the transition, make it fair and just, you know, also supporting the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. My question now to you and the global audience, when we talk about accelerating renewables, we hear from the national point of view, basically the big energy giants, they want to, you know, take basically diversify their business model. But how do you see the potential for community energy, especially for off-grid communities, and in the global south to enable them to kind of like leapfrog into, you know, an energy system that is also benefiting the local population, makes them more resilient, and also enabling them to benefit from it in supporting the local value chain.
Thank you. You could please pass on the microphone.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm from UNCCD Secretariat. When we discuss climate change, we know the hot topic in this big venue is adaptation and also mitigation. So you give the solution, renewable energy may contribute to both. Adaptation, we know the most vulnerable areas is those local communities in developing countries. They may have not enough power available or electricity network. They, for example, in Africa, they need to develop their power system to provide enough energy for their, for example, air conditioning. If the temperature goes much higher in short time, the first emergency is the adaptation is how can make the people survive from the heat wave. And they need energy. So solar, wind, and other renewable energies may give the solution, but how can we make sure those off-grid capacity of renewable energy in remote local area can provide a stable provision of power, electricity, so they can serve to the communities, for example, make their easy life in the changed climate, and make their easy life of improved, secured agriculture system by pumping water, because the water pattern also changed. It's less rainfall, maybe in dry area. They may need more contribution from the power system for their irrigation. So only one way of renewable energy, only solar, might not fit all time demand of the community. So do you have any analysis based on specific geographical settings or climate type, by mixture of different type of renewable energy, we can make sure in maximum the availability of green power for their future scenario? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think these are two very broad questions. Please don't forget, we have still 3 presentations to come, so we will try to answer some of them, but of course this is also limited, so all very important questions. I would now ask Dave. Dave, you're still with us? Just maybe a very brief question, and of course some of these, answer, and some of these questions will also be addressed in the coming presentations. Dave, are you with us? Do you want to give a brief comment?
Yes,
on
I can. I'm not muted, am I?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, those are very good topics to discuss, and I agree that it's not something that we can address quickly. Certainly, photovoltaic technologies are very suitable technology for distributed energy resources, but you still have to be concerned about the quality of the energy that's going into the grid. There's many other issues besides just putting up a PV panel and a battery to provide sources of energy, especially if you're connecting it into the grid. But nevertheless, I think the future energy system is going to look quite different than the current one, and it will be much more distributed. The utility of the future will be quite different than current utilities. But at least that will have to occur in the energy transformation. And then in terms of adaptation versus mitigation, this is a very huge topic. And obviously, adaptation says, okay, we're going to devote our resources to protecting us from what's changing. And whereas mitigation, we try to prevent that change from occurring. And we have to divide our resources into those two camps, in a very knowledgeable way. If we just adapt to more and more warming temperatures and requiring more and more air conditioning, and we don't mitigate the source of energy that goes into the air conditioners, then we're just continuing to create more and more problems. So there has to be a good balance between adaptation and mitigation. I know The Economist had a very good article about this last year, as we're approaching COP26, about does the world could we even achieve a 1.5 degree limit to our warming, even if we put even far more resources into mitigation? I don't think we have a good answer to that question, but I think the choice we make is to address both of these issues so that we aren't just having to constantly pay more and more resources for adapting to a climate change that we could have avoided had we taken proper action.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dave. I think that touched upon the 2 questions that came. Of course, I cannot sufficiently answer it. That's the time of such a side event is too short. I would say again, thank you very much to the United States, to Dave Rene. And then we come to our next speaker, which would be myself. And I have the pleasure to talk to you about the status of wind energy. And also, as our colleague from the International Geothermal Association cannot join us because of some accreditation challenges, I will also speak a little bit about the status of geothermal energy around the world. Can you? Excuse me. Okay, thank you. So starting about where we stand with wind energy nowadays, and I think that already is answering some of these questions. When you look at the kind of, we started with modern wind power in 1980 with 8 megawatt of installed capacity. These first wind turbines were in North America, and then later Denmark started. And today we have 100,000 times the installed capacity. That already shows what can be achieved in a kind of reasonable time. So today, wind power contributes around, more than 7% of the global power demand. And of course, we will hear, of course, power plays a more and more an increasing role in the overall energy mix. When we look at the development over the last few years, you see here also a little bit the continents, and the darkest, the biggest part below is now Asia. So we had, end of last year, more than 840,000 megawatt of installed wind capacity. Even our original estimates were too pessimistic for the year 2021. In spite of the pandemic, many of us expected there would be challenges for supply chain and wind power, but we had actually new installations of more than 100,000 megawatt around the world. Most of this, you can see this here already, with the blue box is coming from Asia, and Europe and North America are, well, a bit behind, we can say. So when you look at the top 10 countries, China is number one, without doubt, with 56 almost gigawatt of new installations in one year. That is what the number 4 here doesn't even have as overall capacity, that is India. So in total, as you see, 845,000 megawatt of installed capacity worldwide, 100,000 installed in 1 year. That is a quite, I would say, encouraging development in some parts of the world. But when we look at United States, still doing reasonably well, but starting with Germany with only 1,700 megawatt installed, new added capacity is still disappointing, because Germany did already like 7 gigawatt a couple of years back. India, Spain, all these countries could do much, much more. Again, when you look at China as being the benchmark, and to show you kind of visually better what that means, total wind power by country, you see here that China stands for a large share. And when we look at, so sorry, there's a slide missing. No, sorry, the new installed capacity, China was more than half of that, 55.9 gigawatt out of 101 gigawatt. And the second largest market, the United States, still quite behind. Again, imagine every country would do what China did last year, then of course the world would move much, much faster. And this is now the shares in overall capacity here. Graphically, again, you can see the importance of China. This is a bit more balanced, because the Chinese share in the overall installed capacity is a bit more than 30%. So what do we see as possible for wind power? Now I'm speaking about wind power. There are scenarios. We made a scenario. Arena came to conclusion that it's possible that wind power could provide 40 to 50% of the global power supply. This is not what we say. This is a must, but this is possible. The wind potentials around the world are big enough, and wind power is still the cheapest power source, renewable power source. And of course, it's also easy to install around the world, and wind power is available almost everywhere. Now let me come, I told you earlier, my colleagues from the International Geothermal Association, they've asked me to present some basic figures about the status of geothermal energy. Geothermal energy, you can see here, just like a summary, is playing a very small role in the power sector at the moment. Within the power sector, it's here, that is again the REN 21 statistics, 0.4% of the renewables is ocean, CSP, concentrated solar power, and geothermal power. So according to our colleagues, there is now, it's a bit over 15 gigawatt of installed geothermal power capacity. That means producing electricity from geothermal energy. That compared to where we are now with wind energy, 850, end of the year close to 1 million megawatt, you see there's quite a range. But you see on that map that the potential around the world is very, very big. Here again is the development. You see a little bit the geographic distribution. Again, China plays an important role. Then we have seen that graph before. Of course, we should not only talk about power, we should talk about heat and cooling, we should talk about transportation. And there, of course, geothermal energy has a big advantage, because it can be applied not primarily, and is not applied primarily for power, but also for, in particular, for heating and cooling. Actually, there are some good examples here around this place here, maybe even this building here. I'm not 100% sure, but I know some of the other buildings, they are getting their heating and cooling from geothermal energy. When we look at the contribution of geothermal to the heating sector, then As you see here, the contribution is already big, but here again, most of it is found in China. You see here also kind of the variety of applications you can use geothermal energy from. So this means from low heat, even from cooling, up to really high, very high temperatures. Again, of course, I'm not the technical expert to explain you that, but of course, the deeper you drill into the ground, the hotter it gets, and then you can even come to temperatures where you can generate steam and directly, of course, propel a turbine. But of course, if we are not that much down, then it's temperatures which may be used directly for heating houses, for example. So summarizing the benefits of geothermal energy, of course, the same benefits that other renewables do have as well. As a renewable energy source, it can be used in a decentralized way. That is certainly true. And it has this stability which wind and sun do not have. Of course, sun and wind are also available throughout the year, but geothermal energy can be done in a very stable way also during the night. Now let's go back and look at the overall picture. We see the development of renewable energy actually in an encouraging way, although we heard already not yet sufficient way, because when we look at the NDCs and what would be necessary to achieve the climate targets and the 1.5 degree maximum decrease of the temperature, then where we are is not sufficient. But where we are is already, and you should be aware of that, that now renewable power, in the power sector, renewables stand for almost all the investment. In that is the year 2020, 83% of the investment in new energy power generation was in renewable energy. Again, coming back to that picture, power is only still a smaller part of energy supply. So we need to look into heating, cooling, and transportation. And on the one hand, we hear that there are renewable sources which can easily also cover heating and cooling, for example, geothermal energy. We also know that a lot of heating, cooling, but in particular transportation sector is going to be electrified. And that, of course, when you look at the growth rates in the power sector, kind of shows us where we can go. We just need to accelerate. I think that is very, very crucial now. So it's very obvious that the main drivers of this renewable future is, of course, that's why we are here, the climate, it's energy security, because all these resources are available everywhere. The sun is shining everywhere, not at the same time, but it shines everywhere. There's almost everywhere wind. Geothermal potentials can be found almost everywhere. And economics are also now, of course, in favor of renewables, because new investment is very obvious. Nobody can pay for nuclear power. Renewables are cheap. Fossil fuels, we know now the price fluctuations. I think it's no need to talk today about the gas prices, for example. Many of you may feel that directly. But if you have a PV system on your rooftop, you will know that you have stable energy prices now and affordable. And this is, of course, what we need to extend. And I think this is a question that you had, or both of you had, how can we accelerate, how can we extend it and make it accessible for people all over the world? And indeed, there is no doubt that the biggest challenge are these kind of socio-economic factors. We have, on the one hand, a lot of investment still, and still new investment, in the fossil and also nuclear sector, which is, if we are serious about our climate goals, much of this is stranded investment. So what to do with this cost? But it's also about making people understand how they can use renewable energy. And again, a simple example, when we talk about solar PV, yeah, everybody knows now it makes sense to have a solar rooftop, but find someone who can install it on your roof. Because there's a very big demand for solar panels and also for those people who can do it. So we really need to mobilize now. We need to start now mobilizing our societies. We need to mobilize people that they understand first, that they want it, that they understand it's better for them, and then we need to kind of teach people how they can do it. And as that was also mentioned here, a very important way of doing it is, of course, making those people who are kind of the users, most of it is end users, are people, citizens, communities, allow them to be actors, take energy supply in their own hands. And again, there's no need anymore, like we have it, again, not so far from here, there's a big coal mine, there's a big coal power plant. None of us here can operate that, but I think everybody here could use a small solar set. So governments must enable people that they can use it. We need to have the right frameworks that allow that, so that the people really understand it is beneficial for us, we want it, we ask for it. And then that is, of course, even more the case when we talk about the developing country context. Because there we have an even bigger challenge. Who is doing the investment? Who is able to afford it? But we know that an investment will pay back. Investment in renewable energy will pay back because people who do not have at the moment access to electricity, for example, when they have access to electricity, they can use it in a productive way, they can generate income, and then they can pay back the loan. So that is why it is so crucial, in particular in the developing country context, to look at who is owning it, who is investing, because if the investment can be done locally, the kind of profit, the added value, which is created through access to electricity, can be reinvested, and then we can accelerate that. I think this is really a key that we have to understand. It is not about, this big shift is not about large investors coming from somewhere and investing big amount of money and taking profit there. It's a huge social task we have, and it's a huge opportunity not only to tackle climate change crisis, to tackle the energy security crisis, and also kind of prevent war and keep peace, but it's to create more equity around the world, more economic opportunities. Again, here we see access to energy, the difference between reinvestment once, let's say, a mini grid is owned locally, there is more reinvestment, then people have more money again to reinvest and extend that, or if it's owned by some foreign investors, let's say. So the future of the energy supply, I think this is now clearer than ever before, must be bottom-up process, I would say. Everybody here in this room, everybody on this planet somehow will play a role in the future as also prosumer, some call it consumer, a prosumer, a producer also of energy. We're not anymore consumers only. This together with the new paradigm of 100% renewable energy and what I call the symphony of the renewables, all the renewables have to play their role. Of course, we also have big companies, big industries, which require different approaches, also more energy, but there is not the one answer how to use exactly renewable energy. But this, without doubt, is the future, the combination of these three elements: decentralization, renewable energy only, and then the right combination. Last but not least, of course, I should mention that we will have end of this month, and I'm so happy because this is my first conference now, a climate conference now for 3 years, because I missed the one in Madrid. We will meet again, and we will have, after also 3 years break, our World Wind Energy Conference in Rimini in Italy, where we also discuss, of course, mainly about wind power. Yeah, with this, I'm at the end with my presentation. So if you can stop that presentation, thank you. Just this. And yes, then I would ask you whether there are any questions directly here, brief questions, because we want also to have some time at the end for discussion before we move to our next speaker. Yes, please.
Hello, thank you for this intervention. I have one question about wind energy. I saw in this graphic that only countries, Japan or Germany, France, China, all countries in the global north, they have great resources or they invest in wind energy. But what's about the global south? Why aren't there countries from the global south in this graphic? What are the limits of wind energy and where to find the potentials to use it in the global south as well?
Well, we have in total now more than 100 countries which are using wind power, large wind power. And our statistics, what I showed here, because it would be a bit confusing to show you a list with 100 countries. And indeed, amongst the top 10 countries, there is none of the least developed countries. We have what you may still call developed. I mean, I don't like these terms, developing countries, especially when we talk about climate change and energy. But of course, China as the leader has still been seen as a so-called developing country. India also. But of course, when we talk about, for example, Africa, Latin American countries, Brazil is now there as well amongst the top 10. You may have seen that. These are not the poorest countries. In Africa, it's starting now investment. I mean, our colleague here is originally from South Africa. He may also tell you about that. South Africa, Egypt, Morocco are countries which are now also investing in wind power on a larger scale. But maybe one reason is that for larger wind farms, you need to have a stronger national grid, because you have wind farms with a capacity of 50 or 100 megawatt. And we know this example, Kenya built a large wind farm, but they had to build a long power line, and maybe they passed villages without even sharing the power there. That maybe reflects a bit the situation. Of course, if you do not have a strong national grid in some of the really least developing countries, let's say my friends from Mali, they do a lot of microgrids, mini grids, and it would make sense to put a wind farm there with 50 megawatt at a village which starts now getting electrified with 100 kilowatt. That is certainly one reason that you need power grids which are kind of more already installed. And of course, the initial investment is then even bigger. But we see now also in an increasing number of African countries, as I said, Kenya, and there's some discussion, Senegal, also between in sub-Saharan Africa, some investment in large wind farms. Again, there is a segment which I didn't touch upon here in my presentations, that's small wind turbines, which are maybe in the range of 1, 5, 10 kilowatt. That is playing a role in some parts of the world as well. We have statistics for that as well. So there's around 1 million of these units. But in terms of when we look at what's the percentage of the power supply worldwide, it's just in the less than maybe percent of a percent. Good. Thank you for that. Then I would hand over to our colleague who is now waiting in the virtual space. And it's my pleasure to welcome Bharadwaj Kumamuru, who is my colleague as Executive Director of the World Bioenergy Association, joining us from Stockholm. Bharadwaj, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Good. Then let me just... start your presentation.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah, I can see my presentation.
Yes, a warm welcome to you, and I hand over to you to tell us about the perspective from bioenergy. Bharadwaj, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. I mean, your, of course, presentation was quite inspirational, so that was very good to follow up on. I mean, also first thanks to the organizers for solving some of the technical challenges of having such hybrid events as we slowly move towards the physical events. I think these are challenging things to do, but I think it's going quite well. And I'm also happy to see the audience. I could see right now I only see you and Rian, but in between I could see the camera. Oh yes, perfect. I see there's there's a few people there who are interested on renewables working together. I'll make sure that I don't keep you too long. I believe there's a reception later on today, which you might all planning to go to. But anyway, it's first of all pleasure to be joining virtually from a very nice, warm Stockholm. So my name is Bharadwaj Kumamuru. I'm the Executive Director at the World Bioenergy Association. To give a brief perspective on how bioenergy technologies are helping solve the challenges of climate protection, as well as providing energy security. Next slide, Stefan. Yeah, most of you have already seen this. I just wanted to highlight that WWEA, along with being part of this REN Alliance group, we are very pleased to be part of this group, and we've done quite a few activities over the years, or quite a few webinars, side events at different COPs. And I think when we start talking about the future energy transformation, we need all technologies and we need all solutions. And we are pleased to be part of this very informal group, trying to showcase how each technology, as well as technologies together, are helping solve some of the big challenges of energy and climate. Next slide, Stefan. Yeah, briefly about the World Bioenergy Association. Most of you may not know who we are. We are a not-for-profit NGO based in Stockholm. We were established in 2008. I've been working with the organization since 2014, so for about 9 years, close to 8 years now. And the main mission is to promote the sustainable development of bioenergy around the world, and also to support the business environment for bioenergy. We've got members from a wide range of stakeholders, including companies, including associations, researchers from all continents, as you can see in the map. And when I say bioenergy, that includes a wide variety of sectors, including solid fuels, pellets, equipment manufacturers, liquid and gaseous biofuel producers, national associations, and so on. And we, similar to other organizations in the REN Alliance group, we have quite a few publications where we focus on the statistics, which is very hard to do for the bioenergy sector, but we also do fact sheets and also organize events and so on. So that's briefly about the WBA. Next, I'll spend some time. I mean, I've split up this intervention into 3 parts. One, whenever we give a presentation, sometimes it's really hard to understand the complexity or the versatility of the bioenergy sector. So I'll briefly spend a few slides on what bioenergy is, where do we get most of the energy from biomass these days, and secondly, what is its current role in the current energy mix. You've seen some of the slides already, and I'll be repeating a couple of them. So secondly, looking at where bioenergy stands in the global energy mix right now, and thirdly, what's the future for bioenergy? We look at, I think Dave's already mentioned a couple of scenarios. So we will also look at a couple of scenarios and what do they say for bioenergy. And finally, some case studies, some examples, both at a power plant level, but also at the national level, on how bioenergy is contributing to meeting, to helping protect the climate, as well as providing energy security. So this picture I've picked up from IEA Bioenergy kind of captures what bioenergy means. As you can see, it's a wide variety of smorgasbord of feedstock, of production processes, of products, and final energy use. We've got the forestry sector, we've got agriculture, we've got municipal solid waste, and all these biomass are fed into, depending on the feedstock, depending on technology, into various production processes to produce solid, liquid, and gaseous fuels, which are then either used directly or converted into electricity or heating or transport. So it's quite versatile. And so when we talk of bioenergy, when you keep hearing about bioenergy, it's important to remember that everything is very specific, context specific. Next is to look at where bioenergy typically comes from. This is a rough estimate. It's typically very hard to get good data on bioenergy. But this is a rough estimate of where the energy comes from in the bioenergy sector. Almost 80 to 85% of all, when we say bioenergy, comes from the forestry side. And this is mainly about 67% from the form of fuel wood or firewood in developing countries or emerging economies in Africa and in Asia, mainly used for cooking and heating. Most of it, of course, in the form in very unsustainable way. And some of it is, of course, converted into charcoal. But there are many examples of energy from wood industry residues, mainly from the sawmills or the paper and pulp industry, but also forestry residues when you've got residues left over after harvesting. And then you've got some, about 6% from recovered wood, that's mainly, furniture and urban waste and so on. After that, about 85%, 10% comes from the agriculture sector, what we say. So it's animal byproducts, so that's agricultural byproducts, but also energy crops. Those are specifically going for energy, which includes, say, for example, sugarcane or oil palm or rapeseed and so on for liquid fuels. And then finally, municipal waste from urban areas. So this kind of captures where the most of the bioenergy comes from. Of course, the future looks quite different in terms of the estimates that show where you can get most of the bioenergy in the future. Our predictions or our estimates say that most of it would come from the agriculture sector, where there's a significant amount of resources which are not utilized these days. Next, when we look at the global energy mix, where we stand right now, this is in terms of consumption. I'm not going to talk much about capacities. I'm going to talk about energy. And bioenergy, of course, first of all, global energy mix, as most of you are still aware, is dominated by fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And this has been the same since the start of the century. Because even though there's been exceptional growth, even exponential growth for solar and wind technologies, we've kept on increasing our demand for energy around the world, which means that the share of renewables has kind of remained the same. And the key takeaway here is that the bioenergy sector is the largest energy source at about 12%, close to 67-70% of all renewable energy. And most of it, of course, I do have to point out, as I've pointed out before, is in terms of fuel wood, where it's imperative that we've got to move from these traditional uses of biomass to modern forms of bioenergy. And that it provides, one of the key benefits is that it provides on-demand dispatchable sustainable energy for millions of people around the world. Next, I think the next slide, you've already seen that. You might be quite bored with it already. But this is from REN 21, which perfectly encapsulates what the challenge is in terms of different end-use sectors and the penetration of renewables in different end-use sectors. All the REN Alliance partners, we work closely with REN 21 and we contribute to their global status report where the image is taken from. And the key thing here is, of course, there's been exceptional progress of renewable energy technologies in the power sector. Whereas the power sector accounts only for about 17% of the total energy consumption globally. The thermal sector accounts for about half of our energy use, whereas transport's about 30%. So you see the penetration of renewables in these different sectors, mainly because of lack of policies, but also strong fossil fuel interests in these sectors has made that the progress have been woefully low in these two, in both thermal and transport, which together account for more than 83% of all energy. And that's where we feel that bioenergy has a significant role to play in decarbonizing not just the heating and cooling sectors, but also transport. And as you can see, it already has a significant share in the current renewable energy share of these two different end-use sectors. And next, briefly, if you look at different sectors and if you look at the contribution of different technologies, renewable energy technologies, I don't know if you can read the numbers and the text, but green is bioenergy. So then it's easy to see that the left, it's the electricity sector, where hydro, wind, and solar have made significant progress already and form a major part of the renewable energy mix for the electricity sector. Whereas for the middle one is the heating, and then it's the transport. As you can see, there's we look at the renewable energy options, they're quite limited, and that's where bioenergy plays a very important role. There is, of course, increased focus on electrification, both for heating and transport. But I think, as Stefan's pointed out before, it's not either electricity or fuels, and that it has to be together. That the challenge is immense, that we can't pick and choose technologies going ahead. And when I say going ahead, looking at the future, when we see the next slide, I've picked up a couple of scenarios. One is from this is from the IPCC's 1.5, the fifth assessment report, which came out, I think, in 2018, which looked at various mitigation pathways for different technologies. First of all, it's quite obvious, is that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, it's significant scale up of renewable energy is needed. When you look at the non-biomass renewable energy, this is compared to 2010. You can see the percentage increase needed to meet the demands for reducing global warming to 1.5 degrees. But at the same time, you still also need a lot more bioenergy, whether it's together with carbon capture and storage or without. Because of this opportunity it provides in meeting in the potential it provides for replacing fossil fuels in various end-use sectors, not just electricity, but also heating and transport. For example, by 2030, the requirements about 30 to 80% increase. By 2050, 120 to 260, depending on the scenario. And when you have to compare, in 2010, it was about 50 exajoules of bioenergy use globally. The next is, of course, the IEA's net zero energy pathway report, considering all the net zero announcements, so climate neutral announcements, which were made last year by many countries around the world. This is a very useful report which came out by the International Energy Agency sometime mid last year, which again looked at various pathways for mitigating, for these countries to meet these net zero targets. And here is quite obvious again, is that to meet these demands, we've got again a significant scale up of renewable energy technologies by 2050. As you can see on the left, in the year 2000, it's still dominated by coal, oil, and gas. But if we have to meet these targets, then we need to scale up renewables. And on the right, you see by 2050, solar should be the largest renewable energy source, followed by bioenergy and wind. Together, and of course with hydro and hydropower and geothermal. And the point here is to make is that because of the versatility of the sector, that it not just replaces fossil fuels in the electricity sector, but also aviation, shipping, heavy duty, replacing natural gas with biomethane, and also clean cooking solutions, which is another big topic, which I'm not going to touch, but it's quite important to talk about. And that in that scenario, bioenergy will be the second largest fuel in 2050. So that's basically where we are, where we need to head. And I'm going to share a couple of slides on some good examples. When we talk about the scale of the challenge, when we talk of renewables replacing fossil fuels, there are a couple of criticisms which come up. Number one is the scale of the challenge. How much can we switch from our dependence on fossil fuels? One example I can share is the DRAX facility, which is I think about 4 gigawatts of coal power, which in about 10 years or so was able to replace most of it with biomass, mainly wood pellets. So that's about 14 terawatt hours of dispatchable renewable power within 8 to 10 years or so, which is a very good example of coal to biomass conversion. And it's not just conversion of fuel, that these also lead to various other innovations, whether it's carbon capture and storage. It plans to be one of the largest sites for carbon capture and storage, but also sustainable sourcing of feedstock. We don't talk about sustainable sourcing of coal, oil, and gas. Where do we get from? What's the impact? But there's a lot of focus on where do we get the biomass from, and there is also innovation and transparency leading up to, because of this replacing of coal with biomass. And it's not just coal to biomass. Another example from the global south, for example, there are some industries which are hard to abate, which need 24/7, 365 days hot water and steam, which are hard, which are difficult to replace. And some people, of course, do criticize the cost of the transformation. Here's an example of a brewery which was initially using natural gas. This is in East Java, which was replaced with locally sourced rice husk and wood chips, which actually helped reduce the cost for the company by about 3 times because it was locally sourced. So another example of gas to biomass conversion. And here the key point is that we don't need to consider gas as a bridge fuel anymore. There are solutions available already which are cheaper than natural gas. And finally, one example, also people talk about the time that we have and the scale of the challenge that we have. This is a good example we feel is a very good thing to share, is a kind of success story of Lithuania. It's about in the last 10 years or so, 10 years before, they were completely dependent on gas from Russia, mainly Gazprom. And at that time, the prices of natural gas increased by about 3 to 4 times because of the monopoly. But strong policies and a good vision by the policymakers ensured that they invested a lot on bioenergy. And there was a complete switch. If you look at the district heating network, there was a complete switch from gas to biomass within a decade or so, where there was literally no biomass. Now biomass in different sectors contributes from about 10% in electricity to about 80% in heating. That, of course, means that there's thousands of jobs which were created in the energy sector, as well as I haven't mentioned here, but the cost of for the end consumer also dropped significantly because, again, locally sourced biomass compared to imports. And this means that unlike some other countries in Europe, it was one of the first countries to be able to announce stop using Russian gas and oil, because of this long-term vision of replacing fossil fuels with biomass. This was a decision not based on energy security or climate protection, but mainly on cost, and that the benefits they are reaping right now. So it is possible, just to conclude, is that the renewable energies, the next slide, the renewable energy technology are playing a critical role in helping reduce the fossil fuel use, protecting the climate, at the same time creating jobs and investments, and that climate neutrality by 2050 is not possible without significant share of renewables, and it's important to focus on non-electricity sectors as well. And we feel that bioenergy, which I haven't touched much upon, is that it also plays an important role when we talk about transformation from the traditional to modern forms of bioenergy and other renewables. And I think Stefan's already pointed out in his intervention that it's very, very critical that we collaborate closely and that we don't sit in our own bubbles, that we talk to other renewable energy technology associations or producers, consumers or prosumers, and to develop a good communication strategy. And the first step is, of course, you start supporting your local or national associations. And there are very good examples of renewable energy already replacing fossil fuels at various levels. And we'll keep trying to highlight these to further the case for renewables providing energy security and helping the climate, protecting the climate. So that's basically it. I'm sorry that I couldn't join you all physically in Bonn. I hope to see most of you in the COP in Egypt. Happy to answer any questions or clarifications on bioenergy, and if not, via email. But I wish everybody else a good conference and an evening reception if some of you are going there. Back to you, Stefan.
Energy, what the prospects are, and also some of the challenges that you see. Anyway, I think it's fantastic that you can join us. Also, you didn't have to travel to Bonn. I wonder how we do all this in the future, because it's actually quite convenient, as we found out the last 2 years. Now, we do not have that much time, but do we have a brief question to Bharadwaj? Yes, please. Briefly introduce yourself, please. And
Thank you. I'm Chiang. I'm from Yangon, the youth constituency here. We would like to ask, what do you say about that biomass requires amount of areas to produce the things which need to be burned, and that there's also, via this burning or this production of energy, creates also CO2. So the challenges of area consumption and CO2 emission, how do you tackle these challenges?
Yeah. Should I answer, or is there
Yes,
any other
please.
question? Okay. But briefly, every technology needs land. It's not just bioenergy. I mean, you need land for building solar panels, you need land for building wind farms. And of course, bioenergy also requires land. There are a few ways which we can tackle to reduce the intensity of utilizing land. And one way we are looking at is actually utilizing agro residues. There's millions of tons of whether it's rice husk or wheat straw or bagasse, which are not utilized right now, which are either burnt on the fields or left as such. And there's a significant opportunity there to utilize these residues for energy without significant impact on land. But that's, of course, a question which we are still trying to answer, considering the challenge, the amount of bioenergy we might need, what are the impacts on land in the future. But right now, we're trying to focus on the low-hanging fruits, for example, these agro residues. In terms of emissions, of course, bioenergy is basically carbon, and if we all remember our high school chemistry, it does produce carbon dioxide. But there are a few things here, and I can talk about for about a half an hour or so, but briefly, we've got to differentiate between fossil carbon and biogenic carbon. Fossil carbon is basically carbon which is in the under the land, which is of course burnt, which adds carbon to the atmosphere. Whereas when we talk about bioenergy and biocarbon, it is part of the natural carbon cycle. So the emissions that we produce by burning biomass, all they are part of the natural carbon cycle, which have been captured by the plants before. And if you start talking about nitrous emissions and sulfur emissions, for example, there's no sulfur emissions, but we talk about NOx and particulate emissions. There's significant innovation already happening. There's some boilers which are actually zero emissions. So there is good innovation happening there, where we actually have no emissions at all from these boilers. So first, differentiate between fossil and biogenic carbon, and then secondly, that there are good innovations and good examples already of low emission equipment already.
very good. So thank you so much again, Bharadwaj, for joining us from Stockholm. Then I'd say we come to our next and last and certainly not least speaker, Rian van Staden, who will kind of summarize of where we are with renewable energy and what are the prospects for a 100% renewable energy future. I've already introduced you, Rian. You are the coordinator of the Global 100% Renewable Energy Platform, a very broad network of different organizations, and it's my pleasure now to hand over to you. You must start the presentation.
My very best.
Don't use the buttons here.
Still don't have a button. It's amazing. New technology. Let me just find my thingy. I have a very nice presentation. Is this where I press Windows P? Extend, duplicate. Whoa. Thanks. Is there a full screen thingy? No. Sure, we can get there. Sorry, I'm not a big Windows guy. I like free operating systems. free everything, free software, free beer. And I have free issues, you're not wrong. Full screen mode, okay. Let's give this a shot. So thank you so much for hanging around for the last speaker. I think it's laudable and unusual. So thank you for your commitment. I have a very nice presentation that I've been thinking about all week and trying to figure out what to say to you. But I think I'm going to veer off in a completely different direction and say a few completely different things. But if you'd like the presentation, I think it will be on the website, and I encourage you to look at it, because it is really well done, I thought. At least the previous people I gave it to felt that way. So, but some basics have to be. You have to have a foundation to build on. So, the Global 100% Renewable Energy Platform started as an initiative, not a platform, but we all grow up. It was founded in 2013 in San Francisco, but it is a global organization. And its basic purpose is to talk about, share information about, and look at ways of achieving our shared end goal. And that shared end goal must be 100% renewable energy, or bust. And at the moment, we're pretty much looking at bust. So we all need to work hard to make sure that we somehow get past this challenge. These are some of the organizations. When you look at the presentation again afterwards, you'll actually be able to read all of them. But these are the who's who in renewable energy and energy efficiency and global lobbying. We're based here in Bonn, which is nice. But we also have started growing, also globally. We have an office in the Ukraine, I hope, Pakistan and elsewhere, and I hope we can do it wherever you are. Because it's not unimportant. We have a website and an email address, like everybody else. Nice picture, well done there. And we have a message. Can't be an NGO these days without a message. And I guess the message is that we all agree that we need to achieve 100% renewable energy globally. Anybody disagree? Nope, okay. That's good. It's not easy. It's not gonna be easy. We never said it would be easy. But if you think back 5 years, nobody was talking about 100% renewable energy, and now we are hardly alone in addressing that particular goal. And that's for a good reason. It's because people woke up and realized that if we don't do something in this direction, we are going to be in deep doo-doos. In fact, we already are. And so it makes a lot of sense to bring together actors and players to talk about the best ways of achieving this target, this end goal. It is an end goal. Pros and cons is funny. Barriers and benefits, yeah, absolutely. And it turns out that differently from perhaps what a lot of people thought 20 years ago, renewable energy has massive benefits and very few barriers. Increasingly, we find that the barriers we always thought we had actually don't really exist. It was just all about money and politics at the end of the day. And now we understand that with renewable energy, we can actually have all the benefits we need. And one of those benefits is, you know, little things like jobs and money and saving the planet. And you have to start. And I think this is the message I think that the platform has been most effective at sending out. You have to start somewhere. Every journey, first step, you know all of these things. So that's what we're doing. We have this idea that there are things that are necessary to achieve 100% renewable energy. We need to do it at all levels, multilaterally, national, regional, local, societal sectors, business, communities, civil society. And in the presentations that you heard here today, you heard a lot of the solutions presented. And before I talk about vertical integration, and these are all policy and politics, and these things not necessarily, these are things that are kind of happening slowly but surely, and people are beginning to understand, local governments and so on, that this is all necessary, that local has to talk to national, has to talk to regional, all of these things. I've been quite ill the last 2 weeks, more or less. In fact, I'm fundamentally quite ill. I have a lot of system problems. And it turns out, so do we all. It turns out that energy, the problems that we have with energy today are largely systemic problems. I trust my doctor to give me medication that kind of matches each other and works together and fits into the system and tries to fix me. Sometimes it works, which is a good thing. You heard a lot about the medicine today. Renewable energy in the form of solar and wind, biomass, and so on. But they only work and they only represent a solution if they fit together. And in the same way, like when you're sick and your doctor says you have to take these medications, but not that one because that's going to hurt you. We're in the same situation. We have renewable energy technologies that can work together beautifully to get us to the point where we can say, no more carbon. I am off the drug. But you can only do that if it's balanced and if your approach is systemic. Maybe that's more important to me than the rest of this presentation, which you will be able to see on the website, and I absolutely suggest you look at. A systemic approach to decarbonization is literally the only way this is going to work. If you're a PV guy, if you're a wind guy, sorry, Stefan, you still have to be aware of the big picture. And fortunately, my colleagues that I work with on a day-to-day basis are very aware of the big picture. But the big picture is the energy systems that we work with and live with on a day-to-day basis. And in the same way that you can only fix sick systems like mine, you can only fix our sick energy systems by taking your medicine, renewables, and taking your vitamins, which is the stuff that makes the medicines work at the end of the day. What are those vitamins? Oh, vitamins, depending on where you come from. Storage, clean fuels, distributed systems, small and large generation. We saw some big generation examples, but we need small distributed generation as well. And when it comes to energy security resilience, which is the system's chance of surviving a disease like war, those things are what makes it work at the end of the day. Now, I have a timeout sign, and I don't need a beat for my rap anymore. But as long as you take the technologies that you've heard about, integrated with things like storage and IT. Can I say IT? Is that allowed? I'm a software engineer, so I'm going to say IT. Intelligent electronic management of energy systems. Please, please, support it. It's what makes things work. The global 100% renewable energy platform brings together people who think about these things all the time. We want you there. We need your support, and we need your vision. So please do that, and thanks for sticking around until the end. Almost there. Thanks, folks. Please have a look at the presentation. Any question? Oh, no. We're out of time. We have to run. But if
Yeah.
anybody has a question, I'll be outside.
I just look at whether, is there another side event coming here, or are we? Okay, yeah, just,
Okay.
we can have one question.
Please. Of course.
Just a second, because it's online.
Yes, yeah, we totally agree with you concept that we need 100% of renewable energy. So no matter what aspect of the renewable, we need working together. But I would like to ask one question. We know you mentioned that storage, the network of distribution, and also might be also other innovative technologies to solve those problems. What is your anticipation comparing to the 1.5 degree scenario? How can we expect when we can achieve 100% of renewable energy? So
We can only do that. We can only do that when all of these things come together. So, for example, we have low-hanging fruit, electricity. It's relatively easy. We're doing well, relatively well. Heating and cooling, yeah, still working on that one. Transport, well, we have some clever plans. And it turns out that some of it's going to be electric and some of it's going to be hydrogen, providing it's blue.
No?
No, providing it's green. For deep decarbonization, for example, of heavy energy use industries, hydrogen is going to be key. But you need all of these things. You can't take one piece of the system and fix that and think everything else is going to be okay. You have to fix all of it. Take a city. It's a system. You can't just do one part. You can break it down into small blocks and do everything there. But even, you asked a question, I think, about developing countries earlier, didn't you? Even combined systems in towns and villages means that we have a better chance of, and yes, we have to, not just decarbonize, but energize without carbon these places as well. They are also tiny little energy systems. And that's why I think a systemic view is good. A knowledge of what technologies are available is good. And what we have on our website is a tool called the, help me, Stefan, I've lost it.
Building blocks.
The building blocks, thank God. I wrote most of them, or some of them. Called the building blocks that can guide organizations and local governments and so on to actually address the systemic view of fixing carbonization in these energy systems. And I think if you approach it that way, you have a pretty good chance of achieving your goals. And we have to achieve those goals.
Thank you very much. I might say we have presented all the advantages of renewable energy in this side event and how far we are, what we can do. It's really now a matter of mobilizing everyone, make it understand, and then we can achieve it. It can be much, much faster. I always refer to the US President Kennedy. He announced in 1968, by the end of the decade, we will have a man on the moon. We need such way of thinking because nobody expected that would happen. Yeah. Such way of thinking, and we are much further in the technology development than the United States were in 1961 to bring someone to the moon, that we can manage it as mankind, but we need to work together. There's no doubt. And everyone needs to contribute.
He said, we do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. If it had been easy, they wouldn't need us. Yeah? We're the people who are going to make this work.
I'm looking to our colleagues here, and with this, I think,
Thank
thank you very much.
But thanks for coming. Thanks for staying.
Thank you for coming.
cow. Old, fat and ugly.